The needle dropped on the vinyl, and the smooth, gravelly voice of Al Green began to fill my small living room in the outskirts of Detroit. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was piling up against the window glass like white feathers. I sat in my worn leather chair, surrounded by the quiet life I had built for myself. I am Otis, a man who spent 40 years of his life in the dirt and the heat. I started as a black laborer in a time when the world did not want to see a man like me succeed. I endured the insults and the systemic barriers, swinging a sledgehammer until my hands bled. Eventually, I turned that sweat into an empire of infrastructure, building the very roads and bridges that people drive on every day. But now I choose to live simply. I hide my wealth behind a modest house and old clothes because I found that peace is more valuable than gold. I wanted to see who people were when they thought I had nothing to offer. The silence of the night was shattered by the sharp vibration of my phone. I picked it up and saw a message from my son Kendrick. It said, "Dad, do not come here. It is dangerous. I love you." My heart skipped a beat, then began to thump with a rhythm I had not felt since the riots of the 1960s. I have seen enough trouble in my 68 years to know the difference between a warning and a desperate plea for help. Kendrick was not a man of drama. If he was telling me to stay away, it meant his back was against the wall. I did not hesitate. I grabbed my old service pistol from the safe, feeling the cold weight of the metal in my palm. I pulled on my heavy work coat and stepped out into the freezing wind. My 2015 Ford F-150 groaned as I turned the key, but the engine roared to life. I drove through the blinding white storm, the tires of my rusty truck clawing at the icy pavement. When I arrived at this massive mansion I had secretly bought for Kendrick, the driveway was packed with luxury European cars. The house was glowing with expensive lights, looking like a palace of greed. I stepped out of my truck, my boots crunching in the deep snow. I was wearing my grease-stained coveralls and an old hat. I looked like a man who had come to fix a broken pipe, not the man who owned the deed to the property. I knocked on the heavy oak door. It swung open, and Cedric Kendrick's father-in-law stood there, holding a crystal glass of expensive cognac. He looked at my rusted truck, and then at my dirty clothes. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He said, "Well, look what the wind blew in. Old man, are you here to beg for some leftovers? Your son does not want to see you right now. He is busy with people who actually matter." Brenda, his wife, stepped up behind him and wrinkled her nose as if she smelled something rotten. She said, "You smell like cheap motor oil and failure, Otis. This is a high-class celebration, not a soup kitchen. Please take your poverty somewhere else before you ruin the carpet." I felt a fire burning in my chest, a roar of anger that wanted to tear them apart, but I suppressed it. I let my shoulders slump and put on a pathetic, confused expression. I forced my voice to tremble as I spoke. I said, "I am so sorry to bother you fine people. The weather is just so bad, and my old bladder is not what it used to be. Could I please just use the bathroom before I head back out into the cold?" Cedric rolled his eyes and gestured toward the hall with his glass. He said, "Fine, but keep your dirty hands off the walls and be quick about it." I nodded my thanks like a broken servant stepping into the house and preparing to find my son. The loud, obnoxious laughter from the party upstairs drowned out the sound of my heavy boots as I slipped away from the hallway. I knew this house better than they did because I was the one who signed the checks for every brick and beam. I moved toward the back of the kitchen and opened the heavy door that led to the basement. As soon as I stepped onto the wooden stairs, a wave of cold, damp air hit me. It was thick with the stench of mold, stale sweat, and human waste. My stomach turned, but I kept going down into the darkness. I reached the bottom and flicked on a dim, flickering light bulb. There in the far corner of the concrete room, I saw something that shattered my soul. Kendrick was slumped against the wall, his wrist shackled to a thick iron hot water pipe with a heavy chain. My son, a man who once stood tall and proud, was now a skeleton of his former self. His skin was pale and waxy, clinging to his ribs like wet paper. His right leg was stretched out at a sickening angle, swollen to twice its normal size and turning a dark, bruised shade of purple. He had been left there to rot in the cold. When the light hit his eyes, he squinted and let out a weak, raspy breath. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "You have to leave. Please just go before they hear you. They are out of their minds. Jasmine and her family. They are crazy. They want me to sign everything over. They want the inheritance." Tears streamed down his hollow cheeks, and he began to sob with a deep, gut-wrenching shame. "I am so sorry, Dad," he choked out. "I should have listened to you. You told me she was no good. You warned me about her heart, but I was too blind to see it. I did this to myself." I knelt down in the dirt beside him, ignoring the ache in my old knees. I reached out and took his trembling hand in my own. My palms were rough and calloused from 40 years of hard labor, and I squeezed his fingers to let him feel the warmth of my strength. I looked him dead in the eyes with a steady iron gaze. "Listen to me, son," I said in a low, firm voice. "Do not apologize. You are a Mercer, and we do not break. I cannot cut these chains right now because I do not have the tools, and I cannot risk them hearing the noise while I am outnumbered. But I am giving you my word as your father. I am going to burn their entire world down to the ground to get you out of here, and I am going to do it the right way." I pulled my phone out and took several clear photos of his broken leg and the rusted chains. I found a small plastic zip bag in my pocket and carefully scraped a sample of the dried yellowish vomit from the floor near his head. I knew the smell of poison when I encountered it. I tucked the evidence away, kissed his forehead, and whispered for him to hold on just a little longer before I headed back up to face the wolves. I climbed back up the basement stairs, my heart heavy with the image of Kendrick in chains, but my mind was as sharp as a razor. As soon as I stepped into the living room, the atmosphere shifted. Jasmine, Cedric, and Brenda were standing in a semicircle, their arms crossed and their faces twisted with impatience. Jasmine stepped forward, her expensive silk dress shimmering under the chandelier. She said, "Otis, I told you to use the restroom and leave. You are making our guests uncomfortable with that smell. It is time for you to go back to your little shack." Cedric moved closer, ready to physically shove me toward the door. I began to tremble, letting my hands shake as I fumbled with the old flip phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and pressed it to my ear, pretending to answer a call. I let out a loud, hysterical gasp that made the whole room freeze. I shouted into the phone, "Pastor! Oh, my Lord! Pastor, can you hear me?" The numbers matched. The Powerball ticket. I bought at the gas station this morning. It is the winner. The voice on the TV just said it. $200 million, Pastor. $200 million. I am a rich man. The Lord has finally seen my struggle. The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear the gears turning in their greedy heads. The contempt on Jasmine's face evaporated, replaced by a wide, hungry stare. Cedric froze in his tracks, his hand dropping from my shoulder. Brenda, who had been sneering just seconds ago, practically ran to the sideboard. The change was instantaneous. 180 degrees of pure, unadulterated greed. Brenda rushed back to me holding a crystal glass filled with the finest bourbon they had. She said, "Oh, Otis, dear, you must be overwhelmed. Sit down before you faint. Here, take a sip of this to steady your nerves." Cedric began brushing the imaginary dust off my old work coat with his hands, his voice suddenly smooth and oily. He said, "I always knew you were a man of hidden depth, Otis. We were just worried about your health in this storm, that is all." I sat down and played the part of the foolish, senile old man. I started babbling, letting a thick country accent slip into my words. I said, "Oh, I am going to take care of my family now. Jasmine, honey, I am going to buy you that yacht you always talk about. And Cedric, you will not have to drive that old car anymore. I am going to get you a brand new Cadillac, the biggest one they make. I can see the future so clearly now." I saw the way they looked at each other over my head. They thought I was an idiot, a lucky fool who would hand over his fortune if they just played nice. I asked about Kendrick, pretending to be worried. Jasmine leaned in, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. She said, "Oh, do not worry about Kendrick, Dad. He caught a terrible flu and he is sleeping so soundly upstairs. He would be so happy for you, but we should not wake him. He needs his rest so he can enjoy all this good news tomorrow." I nodded like a simpleton, knowing my son was starving in the dark, just a few feet below our chairs. I watched them for a moment, their faces glowing with the fever of sudden wealth. They were already spending my imaginary millions in their heads, arguing over which designer brands they would buy first. I excused myself once more, claiming that all the excitement had made me dizzy and I needed to wash my face. They barely looked at me as they waved me away, too busy celebrating their good fortune. I slipped down the hallway, but I did not go to the bathroom. Instead, I moved like a shadow into the master bedroom. I began to tear the room apart with quiet, practiced efficiency. Inside the nightstand, I found a small amber bottle with a white label. My heart sank when I read it. It was a potent sedative used by veterinarians for horses. They were drugging my son into a stupor so he could not fight back. Next to the bottle lay a stack of legal documents. I scanned them quickly. They were quitclaim deeds and power of attorney forms, all demanding Kendrick's signature to hand over every asset he owned. I stuffed the bottle and the papers into my heavy coat, my blood boiling with a righteous fury. I returned to the living room, putting on my best act of a panicked old man. I told them that I had to leave immediately. I said that I had left the winning ticket in my old Bible back at my house, and that my lawyer needed to see it before midnight to verify the claim. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her greed warring with her suspicion. She reached out and patted my arm, but her touch felt like a snake crawling over my skin. She said, "Oh, Otis, you should not be driving in this storm alone. Cedric, why don't you follow your father-in-law in your car, just to make sure he gets there safe and sound?" I saw her wink at him, a silent command to stay on me until he could get his hands on that ticket. Cedric nodded, a predatory grin spreading across his face as he grabbed his keys. The chase began as soon as we hit the main road. Cedric stayed glued to my bumper in his expensive, low-slung sports car, his high beams blinding me in the rearview mirror. He thought he was the hunter, but he did not know these roads like I did. I had spent 40 years driving heavy machinery through the mud and ice of Michigan. I suddenly veered off the paved highway and onto an old, unmaintained logging trail. The snow was deep and the ruts were treacherous, hidden under a thick white blanket. My Ford F-150 bounced and groaned, its heavy tires biting into the earth. Cedric, blinded by his own arrogance and greed, tried to keep up. His sports car was never meant for this terrain. As we reached a sharp curve over a deep drainage ditch, I saw my opening. I slammed on my brakes, sending a cloud of powdery snow into the air. Cedric panicked and jerked his steering wheel to avoid hitting my tailgate. His car lost all traction on the black ice beneath the slush. I watched through my side mirror as his luxury vehicle slid sideways, his tires spinning uselessly before he plunged nose first into the frozen ditch. I put my truck in park and stepped out for just a second. I rolled down my window and looked down at him. Cedric was screaming and punching his steering wheel, his face red with a rage that could not save him now. I did not say a word. I simply tipped my hat to him, put my truck back in gear, and drove off into the night to call in my reinforcements. I watched Cedric in my mirror until his screaming face was nothing but a speck in the darkness. My mind was already moving to the next phase of the operation. I knew better than to dial 911. In this part of the county, the law was a flexible thing that could be bought and sold. I had intelligence from my street contacts that the local sheriff was deeply entangled with Jasmine and her associates, fueled by the dirty money they made from small-scale narcotics. Calling the local police would be like inviting the wolves to guard the sheep. I needed people I could trust with my life. I reached into my glove box and pulled out a separate encrypted phone. I made 2 calls. I called the old guard. 30 minutes later, I arrived at my old construction warehouse on the edge of the city. 2 black SUVs were already parked there, their engines idling in the cold. Out of the first vehicle stepped Big Mike. He was a mountain of a man, a former Marine who had served 3 tours of duty before opening his own high-end private security firm. He looked at me with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and nodded once in silent respect. From the second vehicle stepped Mr. Henderson. He was a lean, sharp-eyed man in a tailored wool coat. Mr. Henderson had been my lead counsel for 35 years. He was a silver-tongued fox in the courtroom who knew every loophole and every legal weapon available to a man of my standing. We gathered inside the warehouse, the air smelling of diesel and old grease. Big Mike began laying out tactical gear on a workbench. He checked his team's heavy body armor and tested the charge on the high-voltage stun guns. He was not there to play games. He was there to neutralize a threat. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson sat at a small folding table with his laptop and a portable printer. He was busy drafting emergency court orders and ex parte injunctions that would give us the legal authority to enter the property and protect my assets. He looked up at me and said, "Otis, by the time we are done, that woman will not even own the shoes on her feet." I sat on a wooden crate away from the noise, my hands moving with muscle memory as I cleaned my old service pistol. The rhythmic motion calmed my soul. I remembered the words of my father, a man who had survived the harshest days of the Jim Crow South. He used to tell me that a black man in this country must be twice as smart and 3 times as tough as anyone else. He told me that a man must protect his family with a cold head and an iron fist. As I snapped the magazine into the grip of the weapon, the last trace of the frail, bumbling old man I had pretended to be vanished. I stood up, and my posture was straight and commanding. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their destruction. I looked at Big Mike and Mr. Henderson and gave the order to move out. The storm was still raging, but the real blizzard was about to hit that mansion. The sun began to bleed over the horizon on Christmas morning, casting a cold gray light over the frozen estate. I returned to the mansion, but the old rusty Ford was gone. In its place was a convoy of 4 black SUVs with tinted windows moving with military precision. Behind them, a heavy flatbed truck carried a massive yellow excavator, its steel teeth gleaming like a predator. We pulled up to the front gate, the very gate I had paid for, but was now being used to keep me away from my own flesh and blood. Jasmine was already standing on the front porch, surrounded by a group of her rough-looking cousins and brothers. They were clutching baseball bats and thick wooden clubs, trying to look intimidating. Cedric was nowhere to be seen, likely still shivering in that ditch. Jasmine stepped forward, her face twisted with a frantic, ugly kind of bravery. She screamed at the top of her lungs. "Get that junk out of here, old man. You have no right to be on this property. I am calling the sheriff, and he will put you under the jail." I did not waste my breath on words. I simply looked at the operator of the excavator and gave a sharp nod. The massive machine roared to life, coughing out a cloud of black smoke that choked the morning air. The steel arm swung forward with unstoppable force. With one violent lunge, it slammed into the wrought iron gates. The metal groaned and snapped like dry twigs, the pillars crumbling into dust as the excavator trampled over the wreckage. It was a beautiful sight, the literal destruction of their arrogance. The thugs on the porch froze in shock. Before they could even raise their bats, the doors of the SUVs flew open. Big Mike and his team of 6 tactical professionals moved in like a tidal wave. They did not fire a shot. They used their sheer size and professional training to disarm the group in less than 60 seconds. Thugs who thought they were tough were pinned to the frozen ground, their faces pressed into the snow. I ignored the chaos and ran straight for the kitchen door with Big Mike right behind me. We broke the lock and headed for the basement. I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw Kendrick still chained, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and agony. Big Mike stepped forward with a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. With one sharp crack, the chain that had held my son captive fell to the concrete floor. Mike lifted Kendrick into his powerful arms as if he were a child. As we walked out of that dark, stinking hole and into the crisp morning air, I saw the sunlight hit my son's face for the first time in weeks. Tears began to burn my eyes and roll down my cheeks, but I did not wipe them away. Jasmine was being held back by one of Mike's men, her hair a mess, and her voice shrill with desperation. She shrieked, "This is my house! You are trespassing! This is a private residence and I will sue you for every penny you have. You think you can just break in here because you have money? I will see you in prison for this." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but pity for the void where her soul should have been. I told her, "Jasmine, you should start worrying less about this house and start worrying more about the cell where you are going to spend the next 20 years of your life." We walked past her Kendrick safe in our arms, leaving the ruins of her lies behind us. 7 days had passed since the morning we broke down those iron gates. The courtroom was packed with people, the air heavy with the scent of floor wax and tension. Jasmine sat at the defense table wearing a modest navy blue dress and holding a white lace handkerchief. She had hired a high-priced lawyer who was known for making villains look like saints. She sobbed into her hands, her shoulders shaking as she played the role of the devoted, grieving wife. She looked at the judge with tearful eyes and claimed that I was a bitter, controlling father-in-law who had concocted a wild story about a lottery ticket just to humiliate her and kidnap my own son. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, stood up slowly. He did not say a word at first. He simply walked to the evidence table and pressed play on a large monitor facing the judge. The courtroom went silent as the grainy video from my phone filled the screen. Everyone saw Kendrick skeletal and broken, chained like an animal in that cold basement. Then Mr. Henderson handed a stack of papers to the court clerk. "These are the toxicology reports from the night of the rescue," he said, in a voice as cold as ice. "The blood samples taken from Kendrick show high levels of ketamine, a powerful sedative used by veterinarians for horses. He was not sick, Your Honor. He was being chemically lobotomized." Jasmine jumped to her feet, her face red with a desperate kind of fury. She had lost her mask of innocence. She screamed at the top of her lungs, "It does not matter what you say." He signed the papers. Kendrick signed over the power of attorney and the deeds to the house and the business. "Everything he owns belongs to me now. That is the law. You cannot take what is legally mine." Mr. Henderson let out a small, sharp smile that did not reach his eyes. He opened a thick leather briefcase and pulled out a mountain of notarized documents. He said, "That is where you are mistaken, Mrs. Mercer. You see, Kendrick has been a very successful architect, but he is also a man who values his father's counsel. Every asset he has ever touched, including the house you were living in, the luxury cars in the driveway, and every dollar in his bank accounts, is held within the Mercer family irrevocable trust. My client, Otis Mercer, is the sole trustee. Kendrick does not technically own a single brick or a single penny in his own name. Therefore, those papers he signed under duress are worth absolutely nothing. You have been torturing a man for a fortune that he never even possessed. The room erupted in whispers, but I was not done. I stood up and looked at the judge. I asked for permission to submit one final piece of evidence. I handed over a medical file from a private surgical center. 2 years ago, when Kendrick went in for what he thought was a simple appendectomy, Jasmine had bribed a corrupt surgeon to perform a secret vasectomy on my son without his knowledge or consent. She wanted to ensure there would never be any children to compete for the inheritance she thought was coming. A collective gasp of horror echoed through the room. It was a level of evil that left everyone breathless. The judge's face turned into stone as he looked at Jasmine, who finally fell into her chair, realizing her world had just turned into a cage. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the wooden bench was like a thunderclap in the silent room. Officers moved in quickly, their leather belts creaking, as they placed Jasmine and Brenda in heavy iron handcuffs. They were charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. As they were led away, Jasmine looked at me with a face full of venom, but I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. My work, however, was not finished. I believe in a justice that is absolute. I instructed Mr. Henderson to move forward with the final phase of my plan. Jasmine's extended family had been living in a dilapidated trailer park on the edge of town, a place they occupied through a series of unpaid debts and shady agreements. By the following afternoon, I had purchased the entire property through one of my holding companies. I did not do it for the investment. I did it for the eviction. I watched from my truck as the sheriff's deputies cleared out the entire clan, tossing their ragged belongings onto the frozen ground. They had helped Jasmine hide my son's disappearance, and now they would feel the bite of the Michigan winter without a roof over their heads. 1 month later, a letter arrived for me from the county jail. The paper was cheap, and the handwriting was frantic. Jasmine claimed she had a change of heart and begged for my forgiveness. Then came the true motive. She claimed she had just discovered she was pregnant with Kendrick's child, my only grandchild. She begged me to pay her $500,000 bail so she could protect the baby. I did not even blink at her lies. I reached into my files and pulled out the medical records we had uncovered during the investigation. Those records proved she had undergone a full hysterectomy years ago due to complications from a reckless lifestyle in her youth. I placed a copy of that medical report into an envelope. I did not write a single word of reply. Instead, I taped a single shiny 1-cent copper coin to the bottom of the page and sent it back to her cell. It was the only inheritance she would ever receive from the Mercer family. 12 months have passed since that dark Christmas. The snow is beginning to melt, and the first hints of green are showing through the mud. Kendrick is sitting across from me by the fireplace in our family cabin. He walks with a slight limp, now a permanent reminder of the price of his silence. But his eyes are clear and his spirit is unbroken. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring and a set of keys to the main headquarters of my construction empire. I am handing the reins to you, son, I said. I am not doing this because you are my blood. I am doing this because you have walked through the fire and learned how to identify the snakes in the grass. You are ready to lead because you finally know what is worth fighting for. We raised our glasses of aged whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light of the dying embers. The clink of the crystal was the only sound in the peaceful room. Outside, the world was waking up from a long, bitter slumber. The peace we have now is not a fragile thing born of luck. It is a peace that was bought with iron and defended with power. I looked at my son and saw a man who would never be a victim again. As we took a sip of the smooth bourbon, I knew that the Mercer legacy was safe. The winter was over, and for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like home. This nightmare taught me that silence is a shield, but action is a sword, and a man must know when to use both. For years, I confused protecting my son with enabling his blindness. I thought hiding my power would keep us safe. But predators do not care about the size of the vault. They care about the weakness of the gatekeeper. True family is not defined by DNA or marriage certificates. It is defined by who stands beside you when the house is burning down. We learned that dignity cannot be bought, and respect must be commanded, not requested. Sometimes, to build a sanctuary of peace, you first have to burn the old life down to ashes.